They say life is a series of moments, but for Sarah Peterson, it was more like a meticulously crafted scrapbook. Every page, every photograph was a testament to the life she and Mark had built over 25 years. It was a life you saw in brochures for suburban utopia. A two-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn, a golden retriever named Gus, and two children who were not just good, but exceptional. Sarah, at 50, carried herself with the quiet grace of a woman who had found her purpose and was content. Her purpose wasn't a career title or a grand ambition, it was her family. She was a high school history teacher, a job she loved, but her true legacy, she felt, lay in the two young adults she was about to send into the world. Her daughter, Emma, was the epitome of her hopes, brilliant, kind, and just weeks away from packing her bags for an Ivy League university. The acceptance letter, framed and displayed on the mantel, was not just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of every late-night study session, every sacrifice, every ounce of belief Sarah had poured into her. Their home on Maple Street was a sanctuary. The air always smelled of freshly brewed coffee in the morning and Sarah's famous roasted chicken in the evening. The walls were lined with family photos, each one a relic of a memory: a trip to the Grand Canyon, Emma's high school graduation, Liam's first soccer game. In every picture, Mark was there, his arm around her waist, a steady smile on his face. He was the rock, the provider, the anchor. Their partnership was a given, an unshakable foundation built on mutual trust and unspoken promises. Sarah believed in him the way she believed in gravity, absolute, certain, and true. The countdown to their 25th anniversary was a joyful event. Sarah had a list a mile long, booking a weekend getaway, finding the perfect gift for Mark, and planning a small party for close friends. She loved Mark not just for who he was, but for who he allowed her to be: a mother, a wife, and a woman whose life felt rich and full. He was the one who managed the finances, the one who handled the grown-up stuff, as she called it, leaving her to focus on the home and the children. It was a fair division of labor, a partnership of equals, or so she thought. The first crack in their perfect picture wasn't a dramatic argument or a tearful confession. It was a Tuesday evening, a whisper of a moment that seemed insignificant at the time. The family was gathered in the kitchen, a rare occurrence now that Emma was an adult and Liam, her 16-year-old son, was engrossed in his world of coding and video games. Mark was on his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen. He was always working, always busy, but that was just Mark, diligent, dedicated, and tireless. "I have some good news," Mark said, not looking up from his screen. "I've been asked to go on a business trip to Miami. It's a huge deal, a potential merger with a new client." Sarah's heart sank a little. "Oh, when is this?" "Next week, for 2 weeks." He finally looked at her, his smile a little too bright, a little too forced. "I know it's bad timing with the anniversary, but it could mean a big promotion, more stability for the family." The words were a comfort, but something in his eyes felt off. It was a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, a shadow that moved too quickly to be real. Later that night, as she was tidying up the kitchen, she noticed Mark had left his laptop on the counter. She never touched his things, it was an unwritten rule of their marriage, but a strange, compelling curiosity pulled her in. She glanced at the screen, and what she saw made her stomach clench. It was an email. The subject line was innocuous enough: trip details, but the first sentence was not what she expected. "Rebecca, the reservation for the hotel has been confirmed. See you soon, my love." The words hit her like a physical blow. The world, her beautiful, perfectly crafted world, tilted on its axis. Rebecca. The name was a common one, but it was not one she knew. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a colleague, a client, but the words, my love, were a stark, undeniable contradiction. She froze, her hand hovering over the keyboard, wanting to click to read more, to know the truth. But a deeper, primal fear held her back. She closed the laptop, a cold dread washing over her. She went to bed that night, lying beside Mark, who was already fast asleep. The silence between them was suddenly deafening. Her mind replayed the image of the email, the words, my love, searing themselves into her memory. The perfect scrapbook of their lives felt less like a collection of cherished moments and more like a fragile photograph. poised to be torn in half. She tried to tell herself it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, but the cold dread in her stomach told her otherwise. The peaceful sanctuary of their home no longer felt safe. The first crack had appeared, and Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the crack would only grow. The morning after Mark's departure, the silence in the house was not peaceful, it was hollow. Sarah walked through the rooms as if in a dream, her every movement heavy with the unspoken weight of her discovery. The framed photos on the walls, once sources of comfort, now felt like silent accusers. She looked at the picture of their family vacation, at Mark's hand on her back, and wondered if it had all been a performance. Had the man she loved been a character in a play, and she, a foolish audience member? The house felt different without him, not just physically empty but emotionally vacant. Every creak of the floorboard, every ray of sun slanting through the blinds reminded her of his absence. She found herself in his study, a room she rarely entered, a place she had always respected as his private domain. The scent of his aftershave still lingered in the air, a cruel, mocking ghost. She sat at his desk, her fingers tracing the keys of his laptop, the memory of the email still a raw wound. It was not enough to just see the surface, she needed to know the depth of the betrayal. With a trembling hand, she opened the laptop. The screen flashed to life, and with a few clicks, she navigated to his email. Her heart pounded in her ears as she searched. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a desperate search for a truth she wasn't sure she could handle. And the truth, when it came, was a tsunami. Email after email, text message transcript after text message transcript. The digital trail was a roadmap of a double life. Rebecca was not just a colleague, she was a meticulously planned future. The messages detailed their rendezvous, their plans, their whispered hopes for a life without Sarah. "I can't wait to be free," one message read. "Just a little longer, my love." Sarah felt a surge of nausea, her stomach turning with every sickening word. But the worst was yet to come. A folder titled Future Plans was buried deep within his files. She clicked it open and saw spreadsheets, legal documents, and financial records. It was all there, laid out in cold, calculating numbers. She saw the transfer of funds from their joint accounts to a separate one she didn't recognize. She saw the number of their family savings, a nest egg built over a quarter of a century, dwindling down to a pathetic few $1,000s. And then she saw it. Emma's college fund, the account that was meant to be untouched, the one they had poured all their love and ambition into for 18 years. It was gone, all of it. The $300,000 they had saved, the foundation of Emma's future, had been drained in one swift, brutal transaction. The world went silent. The sound of her own ragged breathing was the only thing she could hear, not just his half, not just the savings they had built together. He had stolen Emma's future. The shock was a paralyzing force, a physical blow that took her breath away. Sarah's body swayed, and she grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. She had to tell the children. The thought was a spear of ice through her heart. How could she explain this? How could she tell her brilliant daughter that the future she had worked so hard for had been stolen by the one person who was supposed to protect it? She found Emma and Liam in the living room, their faces etched with a different kind of worry. Emma was trying to study, but her eyes were glued to her phone, waiting for a text that would never come. Liam was building a complex computer program, his usual retreat, but his posture was tense, his fingers flying over the keyboard in an agitated rhythm. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma's voice was soft, concerned. Sarah tried to speak, but the words were lodged in her throat. She just pointed to the laptop. Emma, sensing the gravity of the moment, took it from her and read the emails. Her face, usually so full of life, went pale. Liam, seeing the looks on their faces, came closer. He peered over Emma's shoulder at the screen, and his expression hardened. He didn't say a word, but his eyes, so much like his father's, were now filled with a cold, terrifying rage. The silence that followed was suffocating. The three of them stood there, their lives shattered into a million pieces. The perfect family scrapbook had been torn apart, and they were left staring at the gaping, empty hole in the middle of it all. The man who had been the anchor of their lives was gone, and with him, their sense of security, their trust, and a future they had all believed was certain. They were alone now, a broken unit. united only by a shared sense of betrayal and the chilling realization that everything they thought was real was, in fact, a lie. The silence in the living room was a living, breathing entity, heavier than any spoken word. Sarah stood, frozen, the laptop screen still burning the image of the stolen future into her mind. She looked from Emma's ashen face to Liam's expressionless one, and for the first time, she saw them not as her children, but as fellow survivors of a catastrophe. The tears finally came, not in a torrent of sobs, but in a quiet, unstoppable stream that traced lines through the dust on her cheeks. Mom, Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Is it all gone? Sarah could only nod. The words were a physical impossibility. How do you articulate a betrayal of this magnitude? How do you explain that the man they had trusted, the man who had tucked them in at night and taught them how to ride a bike, had systematically dismantled their lives? She sank onto the couch, the grief a physical weight on her chest. Emma, the brilliant, logical Emma, was the first to react. She began to pace, her movements sharp and agitated. We have to call the police, we have to call the bank, we have to report this, now. Her voice was tight with a cold fury, a stark contrast to her usual calm demeanor. But Liam remained still, his eyes fixed on the laptop. There was no anger on his face, only a profound, almost terrifying stillness. It was the same look he had when he was deeply focused on a complex coding problem, a look that meant he was dissecting every variable, calculating every outcome. It won't do any good, he said, his voice flat. He moved the money to a foreign account. It's untraceable. Sarah's head snapped up. How do you know that? I've been watching him for a while, Liam said, without emotion. I installed a keystroke logger on his laptop months ago. The confession hung in the air, another layer of shock. Sarah stared at her son, this boy she thought she knew, and felt a jolt of fear. Why, Liam? Why would you do that? His behavior changed, Liam said, meeting her eyes. He was always on his phone, always deleting his browser history. He was acting shady. I wanted to see what he was up to. A new wave of guilt washed over Sarah. Her 12-year-old son had been living with this suspicion for months while she had been blissfully, ignorantly preparing for an anniversary. While she had been a wife, Liam had been a silent observer, a self-appointed digital guardian. The thought was both terrifying and deeply, profoundly sad. The next few days were a blur of grief and legal frustration. Sarah made the calls Emma had suggested, but each one was a dead end. The bank confirmed the transfers were legal, as Mark had full access to the joint accounts. The police said it was a civil matter, a marital dispute over shared assets. They could do nothing. Every avenue was blocked. Sarah felt the walls closing in on her, her sense of powerlessness growing with each passing hour. She would find herself standing in the middle of her room, a plate in her hand, forgetting why she had gone there. She would burst into tears at the sight of a coffee mug or the sound of a song on the radio. The despair was a suffocating blanket, and she couldn't seem to find the strength to throw it off. The future she had so carefully built was gone, and she had no idea how to start over. Emma, meanwhile, channeled her anger into action. She was on the phone constantly, calling the financial aid offices of every college she had been accepted to. Her voice, usually so confident, now had a desperate edge. I don't understand, Sarah overheard her say one evening. My college fund is gone, my father took it. The raw vulnerability in her daughter's voice was a knife to her heart. Emma began to look at scholarships, loans, and even community college options. Her dreams were being downsized, one phone call at a time, but it was Liam who remained a puzzle. He spent all his time in his room, his fingers flying across the keyboard, the rhythmic clicking a constant background noise. Sarah assumed he was playing games, his usual escape. But one evening, as she was doing laundry, she heard a sound she had never heard from him before, a sharp, frustrated growl. She paused outside his door, her hand on the knob. Liam, are you okay? I'm fine, Mom. His voice was muffled, but the tension was palpable. She pushed the door open slightly. Liam was hunched over his desk, his laptop screen a kaleidoscope of information. She didn't understand the code, the spreadsheets, the complex diagrams, but she recognized the names, Mark Peterson, Rebecca Sterling. Her stomach twisted. He wasn't playing games, he was researching. What are you doing, honey? He didn't answer. He just kept typing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he stopped, spun around, and looked at her. His eyes, so mature for his age, were filled with a cold, unwavering determination. "I'm figuring out how to get it back, Mom. I'm going to make him pay for this." The words were not the empty bravado of a child. They were a promise, a terrifying, absolute promise. In that moment, Sarah saw the boy who had once chased after fireflies had become a young man consumed by a thirst for justice. Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and fear. She had been drowning in her grief, but her son had been preparing for war. She finally understood. She had to stop mourning the life she had lost and start fighting for the one she had left. She looked at her son, this little warrior, and made a promise of her own. She would not let him do this alone. The next morning, the house was no longer a place of quiet despair, but a battlefield headquarters. Sarah, still wearing the worn pajamas she hadn't changed out of in days, sat at the kitchen table with Liam. Her son had pulled up a chair across from her, his laptop open between them, its screen a silent, glowing testament to his unseen world. The coffee maker gurgled, a mundane sound in a world that had become anything but. "He's been working on this for months," Liam said, his voice a low hum. "I started getting suspicious when his phone was always face down on the table. Then he began clearing his browser history every night. My dad, who couldn't even set a password on his tablet." Sarah listened, her heart aching with a mix of shame and pride. While she had been a victim, her son had been a detective. He opened a folder on his desktop, labeled Mark Project. Inside were dozens of subfolders: financial, communication, travel. It was a digital archive of a man's secret life. He clicked on financial and pulled up a spreadsheet. It was a mirror of their joint accounts, but with a second hidden column. "This is a shadow ledger," Liam explained. "He would transfer money from our accounts to a separate one he opened with Rebecca. Then he'd write it off as an expense in our online budget. You never noticed because the final numbers always seem to balance out. Just a few hundred here, a few hundred there. But over time, it adds up." Sarah stared at the numbers, a sick feeling rising in her throat. Every check she had written, every bill she had paid, had been a part of this elaborate lie. But Liam's work went far beyond what she could comprehend. He showed her screenshots of text messages, not from a second phone, but from an encrypted messaging app Mark thought was secure. He had cracked it. He thought he was being so smart, Liam said with a hint of a sneer. But he made some basic mistakes. He used the same password for his secret email account as he did for our family Netflix. Once I had one, I had them all. He was not talking about his father with love or even with anger, but with the cold, detached analysis of a programmer debugging a faulty code. This was not a boy lashing out. This was a strategist building a case. He showed her how Mark had funneled money into various shell corporations and offshore accounts, all set up by Rebecca. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a premeditated, systematic theft. "He was planning this for months," Liam continued. "He knew exactly what he was doing. He was building a new life with her using our money." He clicked on the travel folder. "And he was going to leave us behind with nothing. Look." On the screen was a detailed travel itinerary for two to a small island in the Caribbean. The tickets were for a flight in just 2 days. A wave of ice-cold panic washed over Sarah. He wasn't just going on a business trip, he was going to disappear. The realization was a punch to the gut. The clock was ticking, they had to act now. Sarah looked at her son, a boy who had taught himself the dark arts of the internet to protect his family. He wasn't just doing this for revenge, he was doing it for her, for Emma, for the future they had all been robbed of. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Liam's fingers danced across the keyboard. "We can't go to the police, not yet. He's too good at covering his tracks. The banks won't help us, but I have an idea." He pulled up a complex network diagram. He and Rebecca have a whole web of financial relationships. They use fake invoices and shell companies to move money, but every single transaction leaves a digital trail, and I know how to follow it. He showed her the first part of his plan. He had already sent anonymous tips to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. He had also sent a detailed report of Rebecca's embezzlement to her firm's senior partners. The emails were sent from a series of untraceable servers, a ghost in the machine. He thinks he's so smart, Liam repeated, his voice filled with a quiet confidence that both terrified and reassured her. But he's careless, he's arrogant, and he underestimated us. In that moment, Sarah saw the true extent of her son's pain. He hadn't cried, he hadn't screamed. He had turned his heartbreak into a weapon. His anger was a silent, powerful force channeled into the only thing he knew how to control, the digital world. He wasn't a little boy anymore. He was a sentinel, a protector, an unseen warrior fighting a war she had been completely oblivious to. We have all the evidence we need, Liam said, closing the laptop. He's not in control anymore, Mom. We are, and we're going to make sure he pays for everything he took from us. Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his. The world outside was still going on as normal, but inside their home, a quiet revolution had begun. A mother and her son, armed with a laptop and a shared sense of betrayal, were about to bring a man's carefully constructed world crashing down. And as she looked into her son's fierce, determined eyes, she knew that for the first time in a long time, she was not just surviving, she was fighting back. The next few days were a blur of meticulously planned action. The kitchen table, once a gathering place for family dinners, had become the war room. Sarah, armed with a newfound resolve, sat beside Liam as he navigated the labyrinthine digital world of his father's betrayal. Emma, though hurt and withdrawn, was a silent witness, her eyes occasionally darting to the screen, a flicker of morbid fascination on her face. Liam, it turned out, was not just a tech whiz. He was a strategic thinker. He laid out their plan with the calm precision of a general preparing for battle. Phase 1, he explained, pointing to a document on the screen, is about exposing Rebecca. He showed Sarah a detailed log of Rebecca's online activity. She wasn't just Mark's mistress, she was an accomplice. Liam had uncovered her social media profiles, her professional history on LinkedIn, and even her personal blog. He had found a paper trail of her embezzlement, showing how she used her position at Mark's firm to siphon money from their clients' accounts. The money she stole was used to fund a lavish lifestyle, and more importantly, to set up the offshore accounts where Mark's money had disappeared. She's a criminal, Mom, Liam said, his voice hard. She has a history of financial fraud. This wasn't a sudden thing. She's been doing this for years. Sarah felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just a woman who had stolen her husband. She was a predator who had targeted her family for financial gain. The injustice of it all fueled her resolve. What's phase 2? She asked. We need to get to the money, Liam replied. I've been tracking every transaction. He and Rebecca used a web of shell corporations to hide the funds, but they made a mistake. They used a public IP address on a few occasions. It's a small mistake, but it's enough. He explained how he had traced the funds from their personal accounts to various international banks, each transaction a breadcrumb on a trail of deception. He had even found the location of the bank accounts, a small island nation with lenient financial regulations. It was a digital treasure map, and Liam was the only one who could read it. We can't just go to the police with this, he cautioned. It's all circumstantial. We need to hit them where it hurts. We need to make them panic. Their plan was a masterclass in digital warfare. First, Liam would send an anonymous, detailed report of Rebecca's embezzlement to her firm's senior partners and her professional licensing board. The evidence was irrefutable, leaving no room for doubt. Then, he would send a similar report to a few key financial news outlets, ensuring the story would go viral. The goal was to destroy Rebecca's career and reputation, making her a liability to Mark. She's his weak spot, Liam said, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculating light. Once she's out of the picture, he'll be on his own, he'll have nowhere to run. As the days passed, Sarah watched her son transform. He was no longer the boy who spent his days lost in video games. He was a focused, determined young man on a mission. He worked in secret, his fingers a blur on the keyboard as he meticulously prepared the digital payloads. Sarah, meanwhile, began preparing for her own part of the plan. She filed for divorce, a symbolic act that felt both heartbreaking and liberating. She also started compiling her own evidence, printing out all the documents Liam had found, making physical copies of the betrayal. One afternoon, Emma came to her, her face pale. I just got an email from the university, she said, her voice shaking. They're rescinding my acceptance. They found a discrepancy in my financial aid application. The college fund? It's gone. Sarah's heart broke all over again. The theft wasn't just a number, it was a lost dream, a future that had been stolen. But this time, she didn't collapse. She looked at Emma and saw her own fear reflected in her daughter's eyes. We'll get it back, honey, Sarah said, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she had. We're going to get it all back. Emma looked at her, then at Liam, who was silently working on his laptop. The two of them, a mother and a son, had become an unstoppable force. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also a comforting one. The world they had known was gone, but they were building a new one, brick by digital brick. The night before Mark's scheduled flight, Liam gave the signal. The emails were sent, the reports were filed, and the digital bomb was detonated. Sarah sat with him, watching as the first news story broke, a small blurb on a financial news website that would soon become a wildfire. The story was about Rebecca Sterling, a prominent financial advisor who was under investigation for embezzlement. It's working, Liam said, a rare smile on his face. The plan was in motion. They had sent the first volley, and now they would wait for the inevitable storm to come. Mark had thought he had planned the perfect escape, but he had underestimated the one thing he had never seen coming: the quiet, determined rage of a mother and her son. And as Sarah watched the digital world begin to turn against her husband, she knew that for the first time in a long time, the scales of justice were finally beginning to tip in her favor. The digital bomb Liam had detonated began to ripple through the world like a shockwave. Sarah, glued to her laptop in the quiet of the night, watched as the initial trickle of news about Rebecca Sterling turned into a torrent. What began as a small blurb on a financial news blog soon exploded into a full-blown scandal. Major outlets picked up the story, their headlines screaming about financial misconduct and embezzlement. The anonymous reports Liam had sent were so meticulously detailed and well-sourced that no one could question their veracity. It's working, Mom, Liam said, his voice a low hum from across the kitchen. He was tracking the stories spread in real time, a map on his screen showing the locations of news outlets and financial firms that were now investigating Rebecca. Her firm just released a statement. She's been placed on administrative leave pending a full review. The satisfaction of watching Rebecca's world crumble was a grim comfort. Sarah had to admit there was a part of her that reveled in the thought of the woman who had stolen her life now facing the consequences. But the true target was Mark. The first sign of the unraveling of Mark's world came the next day, in the form of a frantic, strained phone call. The number was unfamiliar, a burner phone, and Sarah hesitated before answering. Hello? Sarah, it's me. Mark's voice was different. Gone was the calm, controlled demeanor. In its place was a frantic, panicked urgency she had never heard before. Mark, listen to me. Something is happening. Something is very wrong. My bank just froze all my accounts. They said there was a flag for suspicious activity. And Rebecca, she just called. She lost her job. His words were a chaotic tumble, a man desperately trying to make sense of a world that was suddenly spiraling out of his control. Sarah felt a surge of cold satisfaction. She glanced at Liam, who was silently working on his laptop, a focused intensity on his face. He looked up and met her eyes, a silent confirmation that this was their work, their vengeance unfolding. I don't know what you're talking about, Mark, she said, her voice steady and calm, a stark contrast to his. You told me you were on a business trip. What do Rebecca's problems have to do with you? It's too much of a coincidence, Sarah. This is all connected. Someone is targeting us, someone with serious technical skills. Rebecca thinks it's a disgruntled colleague, but he paused, his breath catching. But I'm not so sure. My laptop? I just logged in my email. Someone just sent a message from my account to my boss. Liam, with a subtle movement, clicked a key on his laptop. The phone line emitted a soft beep, a sound too faint for Mark to hear clearly, but a sound that told Sarah everything she needed to know. Liam was in his system. He was watching. Mark's panic was audible now, a ragged gasp through the phone line. Sarah, they're in my computer right now. They're in my social media accounts. They're posting things, financial documents, private messages between me and Rebecca. He was witnessing the very process of his downfall. He had no idea that the silent, methodical destruction was being orchestrated by the son he had betrayed. I have no idea what you're talking about, Mark, Sarah said, her voice still unwavering. Perhaps you should call the police if someone is hacking your accounts. I did. They said they can't help because the information being posted is true. They said it's whistleblowing, not harassment. How could they have access to true financial documents unless they were inside my accounts? The realization was hitting him. He wasn't being framed, he was being exposed. The web of deceit he and Rebecca had so carefully constructed was being torn apart thread by thread. Mark's voice turned desperate. I have to make you understand, Sarah. The money, I was going to pay it back. It was a temporary loan. We had an investment opportunity, a sure thing. Rebecca's father has connections. We were going to be so wealthy, wealthy enough to pay for Emma's college 10 times over. The lies were so brazen, so pathetic, that Sarah felt a mix of disgust and pity. He was a cornered animal, lashing out with whatever excuses he could find. But the lies were his final mistake. Liam, who had been listening with an unnerving stillness, looked up from his screen. He caught his mother's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He had heard enough. I'm begging you, Sarah. Mark's voice was a plea now, broken and defeated. Whatever you've done, whatever you know, please just stop. I've lost everything. Rebecca left me. She blocked my number. I have nothing left. Sarah looked at the phone in her hand, at the man on the other end, who had once been her husband, the father of her children. He was a ghost of a man, stripped of his lies, his money, and his mistress. She had won, but it wasn't a victory that brought her joy. It was a victory of cold, brutal justice. She was no longer just a victim, she was a survivor who had fought back. Actions have consequences, Mark, Sarah said, her voice low and final. You taught us that, you chose your life, now live with it. She hung up the phone. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at Liam, her heart a mix of pride and fear. Her son had just systematically dismantled a man's life with the same calm precision most kids used to complete homework. The boy who had once been a quiet observer was now an architect of vengeance. And in the unsettling quiet of their home, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The phone in Sarah's hand felt cold and heavy, a dead weight in the aftermath of Mark's call. The silence that followed his broken plea was deafening, filling the kitchen with an unsettling calm that was more terrifying than any scream. Sarah looked at Liam, who was still hunched over his laptop. He had orchestrated a man's downfall with the silent, surgical precision of a seasoned professional, and he was just a child. He won't call back, Liam said, without looking up. His voice was flat, matter of fact. He knows I'm watching. He knows there's no point. The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The enemy had been defeated, but at what cost? What kind of person had her son become in the process? He had protected them, but in doing so, he had lost a part of his innocence. The next morning, Emma walked into the kitchen, a phone in her hand, a troubled expression on her face. Mom, she said, her voice shaking. It's Dad. He just sent me a text. He wants to meet me. He says he needs to explain everything. A wave of panic washed over Sarah. Mark was a cornered animal, and she knew how dangerous they could be. She couldn't let him get close to her children. No, Emma, she said, her voice firm. Don't respond. He's just trying to manipulate you. But Mom, Emma pleaded, he's my father. I need to know why he did this to me, why he took my future. Before Sarah could protest further, Liam walked in, a calm authority in his demeanor that belied his age. Don't go alone, he said, looking at Emma. We'll all go together. Sarah looked at her son, and for the first time she saw a strategist, not just a child. They had to face him. They had to show him that they were not the broken victims he had left behind, but a united front, strong and unbreakable. They met Mark at a neutral location, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. He was waiting for them, a shadow of the man he once was. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his clothes were wrinkled and unkempt. He looked defeated. Sarah, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Thank you for coming. Sarah just nodded, her face a mask of stone. She sat down, her hands clenched in her lap. Emma sat beside her, her gaze fixed on her father. Her face a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Liam sat across from them, his laptop open on the table, his fingers already typing. He was not here to talk, he was here to watch. Mark began to talk, his words a desperate stream of excuses and half-truths. I never meant for it to go this far, Sarah. It was a loan, just a loan. Rebecca had this investment opportunity, a sure thing. We were going to make it big, and I was going to pay you back with interest. You were going to be so proud of me. Sarah listened, her anger rising with every word. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was just sorry he had been caught. He was still the same self-centered man who had thought he could get away with anything. You took our daughter's future, Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. You took every last dime we had saved for her and you used it to build a new life with your mistress. Mark flinched. It wasn't like that. She's not just a mistress, Sarah. She's a criminal. Liam's voice cut in, cold and sharp. Mark's eyes widened in surprise as he looked at his son. And you helped her. You committed fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. You took our money and ran. You didn't just take Emma's future. You took ours, too. Mark's face went pale. Liam, I don't understand. How do you know all this? I have copies of everything, Dad, Liam said, his fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up documents and screenshots on the screen. Every email, every text message, every forged document. I've been watching you for weeks. I know about the second phone you thought you hid so well. I know about the fake investment accounts Rebecca created to hide the money she stole. And I know that when the money ran out and Rebecca got fired, she stopped returning your calls. The words were a brutal, unforgiving reality check. Mark's world was collapsing right in front of him, and he had no idea how to stop it. He looked from his son to his daughter, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope. Emma, he said, his voice cracking. Please, I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your father. I love you. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. You chose her over us, Dad, she said, her voice a quiet sob. You chose money over your family. You chose to steal my future to pay for your new life. Mark reached for her, but Emma recoiled, her face a mask of pain. The final, heartbreaking blow had been delivered. He had lost not just his family, but their respect and their love. Mark's shoulders slumped in defeat. He had no more excuses, no more lies to tell. He had been a king in his own mind, but now he was just a broken man, stripped of his crown. The family he had so carelessly abandoned had returned, not as victims, but as an unstoppable force, a force that had brought him to his knees. The confrontation at the cafe was the final, devastating blow. Mark didn't scream, didn't argue, didn't even try to beg. He simply sat there, a broken man in a cheap suit, as his carefully constructed lies were dismantled by the two people he had wronged the most. The quiet click of Liam closing his laptop was the final punctuation mark. The family he had abandoned had returned, not to plead for his return, but to deliver a verdict. They left him there, a lonely figure in a crowded room, a man who had lost everything. They didn't look back. There were no more tears, no more words, just a chilling, resolute silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt a sense of relief. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. It had closed a chapter, allowing them to finally begin the long, painful process of healing. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal appointments and paperwork. Sarah filed for divorce, a process that was surprisingly swift and uncomplicated. The evidence Liam had gathered was so thorough and damning that Mark's lawyer advised him to agree to all of Sarah's terms. He signed the papers from a motel room, a stark contrast to the luxurious house he had once called home. The kids began to heal in their own ways. Emma, once lost and devastated, found her purpose again. She began to volunteer at a local community college, tutoring students in history and English. She had lost her chance at an Ivy League education, but she was determined to build her own future. She was still in a lot of pain, but she was a fighter. She channeled her anger and frustration into her work, and slowly but surely she began to find her way. Liam, meanwhile, retreated back into his digital world, but this time it was different. He was no longer just a boy playing a game. He was a master builder, constructing a new life from the ashes of the old one. He began to work on a new project, a free open source software that could help families track their financial accounts and detect signs of fraud. He called it Sentinel, a tribute to the silent guardian he had become. Sarah watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and worry. He was so brilliant, so focused, but she couldn't help but wonder if his trauma had made him too cold, too detached from the real world. She tried to talk to him about it, but he just shrugged and said, "I'm fine, Mom. I'm just being productive." As for Sarah, the healing process was a slow and arduous one. She went to therapy, talking through the grief and betrayal with a kind, patient woman who helped her see that she was not to blame for Mark's actions. She began to find her own strength, a strength she never knew she had. She had always been Mark's wife or Emma and Liam's mom. Now she was just Sarah. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. One evening, as they were all sitting in the living room, a documentary about financial fraud playing on the TV, Emma turned to Sarah and said, "We're going to be okay, aren't we, Mom?" Sarah looked at her daughter, at her brilliant, resilient daughter who had lost so much and yet had found the strength to carry on. She looked at her son, at the quiet, determined young man who had become a protector and a builder. And she looked at herself, at the woman who had once been broken and lost, but who was now standing on her own 2 feet. "Yes, honey," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "We are." The road ahead was still long, but they were no longer walking it alone. They were a team, a family forged in the fires of betrayal and heartbreak. The man who had tried to destroy them had, in the end, only made them stronger. They had lost a husband and a father, but they had found something far more valuable, a new beginning, a renewed sense of purpose, and the unshakable bond of a family that had survived the impossible. The silence in the Peterson house was no longer filled with the heavy cloak of grief. It was now the quiet hum of purpose. Sarah had found a rhythm in her new life. She had returned to her job as a history teacher, but with a renewed sense of passion. She no longer saw her work as a simple means to an end, but as a way to inspire and empower her students. She used her own experiences as a cautionary tale, teaching them about the importance of financial literacy and personal responsibility. Her class, once a dull lecture on the past, became a lively discussion on the present, a place where history and reality collided. Emma, too, had found a new direction. With her Ivy League dreams on hold, she had enrolled in a local community college, taking classes in business and finance. She worked 2 jobs to pay her tuition, her hands calloused from serving coffee and her mind sharp from late-night studying. She had lost her chance at a prestigious education, but she had gained a fierce independence and a practical understanding of the world. She no longer dreamed of a career in academia. She now wanted to build something of her own, a business that would help other young people avoid the mistakes her family had made. But it was Liam who had truly transformed. He had taken his pain and turned it into a mission. He spent every waking moment in his room, hunched over his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a newfound intensity. He wasn't just working on his Sentinel software, he was building a movement. He created a blog, a free online resource where he shared his knowledge of cybersecurity and financial fraud. He wrote in a simple, straightforward style, explaining complex concepts in a way that anyone could understand. His blog posts were a lifeline for families who had been through similar experiences, and they quickly gained a following. He began to receive emails from all over the country, from people who had been victimized by family members, from parents who had been betrayed by their spouses, and from children who had been robbed of their future. He responded to every single one of them, offering advice and guidance. He was a silent guardian, a digital Robin Hood, helping people fight back against the very crimes that had destroyed his own family. He was no longer just a boy playing a game. He was a warrior fighting a war that no one else could see. The 3 of them had become a team, each with their own role to play in the fight for justice. Sarah was the emotional anchor, the one who held them together when they felt like falling apart. Emma was the practical force, the one who kept them grounded in reality and reminded them of their ultimate goal. And Liam was the silent force, the one who worked behind the scenes, using his incredible mind to protect them and others from the dangers of the digital world. One evening, as Sarah was helping Emma with her homework, Liam came out of his room, a small smile on his face. "I have something to show you," he said. He pulled up a website on his laptop. It was a beautiful, professionally designed website for his Sentinel project. It was a complete guide to financial security, with sections on password protection, recognizing forged documents, and reporting fraudulent activity. It was more than a blog, it was a resource, a beacon of hope for families in need. "I'm going to make this a nonprofit," he said, his voice filled with a quiet passion. "I'm going to help as many people as I can. This isn't just about us anymore, Mom. It's about helping others avoid what we went through." Sarah looked at her son, and her heart swelled with a mix of pride and awe. He had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to them and turned it into a force for good. He was not just surviving, he was thriving. He had found his purpose in the wreckage of his life, and he was using his incredible gifts to make the world a better place. The man who had tried to destroy them had, in the end, only made them stronger. They had lost a husband and a father, but they had found something far more valuable: a new beginning, a renewed sense of purpose, and the unshakable bond of a family that had survived the impossible. The journey was not over, but they were no longer just walking it. They were running it, their heads held high, their hearts filled with a quiet, fierce determination. The ripple effect of the Peterson family's journey began to spread far beyond the confines of their quiet suburban home. Liam's Sentinel blog had gained traction, evolving from a simple online resource into a national phenomenon. He had written a series of detailed guides on recognizing financial red flags, protecting personal information, and navigating the legal system in cases of familial fraud. His work was so thorough and so practical that it caught the attention of a national news network. One evening, a producer from Channel 7 News called the house, asking to do a feature on Liam's work and the story behind it. Sarah was hesitant at first. She was not a public person, and the thought of sharing her family's pain with the world was terrifying. But Liam, with a newfound maturity, convinced her. "Mom, this isn't about us anymore," he said, his voice firm. "This is about helping other people. We can use our story to prevent this from happening to other families." The news segment was a turning point. It aired during prime time, a powerful and moving story about betrayal and resilience. It told the story of a father who had stolen from his family and a young boy who had fought back with nothing but a computer and a fierce determination. The segment ended with a shot of the three of them, a family forged in the fires of betrayal, standing together, strong and unbreakable. The response was overwhelming. The Sentinel blog received millions of hits, and thousands of emails poured in from people who had been through similar experiences. They shared their stories of pain and betrayal, and they found a sense of community and hope in the Petersons' story. Liam was hailed as a hero, a modern-day Robin Hood who used his incredible gifts to fight for justice. He was invited to speak at cybersecurity conferences and universities, and he was offered full scholarships to some of the most prestigious schools in the country. Emma, too, found a sense of purpose. She had started a small online business, offering financial counseling and advice to young people. She used her own experiences to help them understand the importance of financial literacy and independence. She was not just a tutor, she was a mentor, a big sister, and a role model. She helped them create budgets, open their own bank accounts, and protect their future from the very forces that had threatened to destroy hers. As for Sarah, she had become a symbol of strength and resilience. She was no longer just a history teacher. She was an advocate, a speaker, and a voice for change. She began to speak at women's conferences and community centers, sharing her story and empowering other women to take control of their lives. She had lost her husband, her home, and her sense of security, but she had gained something far more valuable: a renewed sense of purpose and a voice that could help others. The man who had tried to destroy them had, in the end, only made them stronger. They had lost a husband and a father, but they had found something far more valuable: a new beginning, a renewed sense of purpose, and the unshakable bond of a family that had survived the impossible. The journey was not over, but they were no longer just walking it. They were running it, their heads held high, their hearts filled with a quiet, fierce determination. The Petersons were no longer victims, they were survivors. They had taken the ashes of their past and built a life filled with purpose, hope, and an unshakable bond that would last a lifetime. Years passed, a quiet march of time that saw the Peterson family rebuild their lives not just with new foundations, but with a different kind of architecture. The pain of the past had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of purpose and the strength of their unshakable bond. Liam, now a young man in college, was a force in the cybersecurity world. His Sentinel nonprofit had grown into a recognized organization, offering free resources and consultations to families across the country. He had not only recovered from his trauma, but had used it to build a legacy of protection and empowerment. He was no longer a silent warrior. He was a leader, a voice of reason in a world that had become increasingly complex and dangerous. His work was his therapy, and his purpose was his strength. Emma, too, had found her calling. She had graduated from community college with honors and had used her practical skills to start her own financial consulting firm. She specialized in helping young people and single parents navigate the often confusing world of finance, ensuring that no one else would have to go through the same ordeal her family had. She was a testament to the idea that a setback can be a setup for a comeback, and her life was a powerful example of what can be built from the ashes of betrayal. As for Sarah, she had found a new kind of peace. She had retired from teaching, but her work was far from over. She had become a speaker, a writer, and an advocate for victims of financial fraud. She traveled across the country, sharing her story, and in doing so, she gave a voice to the voiceless. She had lost her husband, her home, and her sense of security, but she had gained something far more valuable: a renewed sense of purpose, a voice that could help others, and a deep, profound understanding of the resilience of the human spirit. One evening, as they were all sitting in the living room, a documentary about financial fraud playing on the TV, Emma turned to Sarah and said, "We're going to be okay, aren't we, Mom?" Sarah looked at her daughter, at her brilliant, resilient daughter who had lost so much and yet had found the strength to carry on. She looked at her son, at the quiet, determined young man who had become a protector and a builder. And she looked at herself, at the woman who had once been broken and lost, but who was now standing on her own 2 feet. "Yes, honey," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "We are." The road ahead was still long, but they were no longer walking it alone. They were a team, a family forged in the fires of betrayal and heartbreak. The man who had tried to destroy them had, in the end, only made them stronger. They had lost a husband and a father, but they had found something far more valuable: a new beginning, a renewed sense of purpose, and the unshakable bond of a family that had survived the impossible. To everyone who has followed the journey of the Peterson family, thank you. Thank you for opening your hearts to their story, for sharing in their pain, and for celebrating their triumphs. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. No matter what challenges you face, remember that your strength is not measured by the absence of pain, but by your ability to overcome it. May you all find the strength to face your own battles, and may your own stories be filled with love, resilience, and a new kind of victory. I wish you all good health and happiness for your families.